Former President Donald Trump himself personally told the various European nations that they really need to focus their full attention on the situation in Ukraine. However, the fundamental question remains whether Russia is genuinely prepared to permit the Europeans.
Do you intend to actively participate and play a significant role in Ukraine, particularly in the period following the establishment of a potential peace agreement? If you would like to answer, the second question is it possible for you to take on a constructive role that will eventually lead to a stable and enduring lasting peace? I don't see such figures in Europe among those who are active on the Ukrainian issue. First and foremost, that's Berlin, Paris. I've even forgotten already. Brussels, of course, now Helsinki, the Baltic countries, and London, by the way, which is increasingly speaking on behalf of the European Union. I don't even know, maybe they've submitted an application asking to be taken back. But this is the quartet that has formed: Starmer, Macron, Merz. And these are probably the main figures. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen and other Brussels leaders. I don't see any interest on their part in ending the conflict. Let me remind you once again of what I said some time ago in this hall. They are seeking approval for Zelensky's plan, as they call it, consisting of some 20 points, the essence of which boils down to one thing: an immediate ceasefire accompanied by a declaration of legal security guarantees for Ukraine. This naturally leads us to the important question of what they will address. So, what does this look like now, and what is the reality? In reality, these are guarantees for the preservation of the current Nazi regime on that part of Ukraine's territory, which will remain under this regime's control. In 2014, in February after the coup d'etat, we told the Europeans, just 2 days before the coup, you guaranteed an agreement between the then president and the opposition that there would be early elections and that there would be no use of force. Make the opposition fulfill these agreements and vacate all the administrative buildings they have occupied. In Paris, in Berlin, and in Warsaw, we were told. They averted their eyes in embarrassment and said, "Oh, you know, sometimes democracy takes on very unusual forms." That was it. We appealed to the Americans as well, because before this agreement was reached to settle things between the president and the opposition. In February 2014, Obama called Putin and asked him, "Vladimir, please don't interfere with the signing of this agreement." Putin said, "President Yanukovych, who was in office at the time, is ready to sign it. How can I prevent the legitimate president of a sovereign state from making his own decisions?" Then we called the Americans and said, "You asked us to support this, and we did. Can't you control your own protégés, the ones you financed and who ultimately started this whole coup?" They didn't answer at all. And when the group of coup leaders who came to power immediately declared that they would revoke the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, that was the very first official announcement. And the second official announcement was that they sent a squad of militants to storm Crimea and seize the building of the Crimean parliament. When after that, the people of Crimea rose up against this government and said, "Leave us alone, we don't want anything to do with you," they held a referendum. Then Donbass did the same thing. The Kiev regime sent in combat forces, used military aviation and artillery, violating all norms of international humanitarian law against its own people. Europe missed its chance for the first time, excuse the blunt language, in February 2014, when it failed to make the opposition fulfill the terms of the agreement guaranteed by Europe. The second chance for Europe came in February 2015, when, with the participation of France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia, the Minsk agreements were signed. France and Germany always stated that these agreements were between Moscow and Minsk, and that we, Berlin and Paris, were their guarantors. They proceeded to the UN Security Council, where these agreements were approved. But then it turned out, and both former President Hollande and Merkel said about a year or two ago, they admitted that no one ever intended to fulfill these agreements. They needed to buy time to rearm Ukraine. Exactly what is now openly declared as an imperative for Ukraine. A ceasefire for 2 months or even longer, and then we'll see. And most importantly, to preserve the regime. Then, in April 2022, when, at Ukraine's suggestion, the parameters for a settlement were agreed upon during negotiations in Istanbul, Europe in no way opposed Boris Johnson, who forbade Zelensky from signing these agreements. That's all there is to it. So I can't understand where exactly Europe is trying to go now. Again, into some situation where it will be possible to deceive everyone, lie to everyone, and continue to push your anti-Russian agenda in practice? Why do you need this? You're already trying hard enough as it is. Unfortunately, Europe, which is the source of all of humanity's misfortunes, all the major misfortunes of humanity, starting with slavery, colonialism, and the instigation of 2 world wars with a colossal number of victims, somehow cannot change this mentality. And when you read today's leaders and follow the intrigues they weave, it's all just to preserve an absolutely hostile to Russia regime, a governing regime that was held strictly accountable to them, openly professing and advocating the very same ideological ideas and practices of Nazism that brought Adolf Hitler to Nuremberg. This never goes away. I'm amazed. But the healthy forces in Europe have finally awakened, and their voices are already being heard. And not only in Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, but also in Germany and France as well. There are forces that above all care about their own national interests, not about imperial ambitions that have long since. They were destroyed and will never return. Recently, both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European Union, and the OSCE have been used to penetrate regions of our country's historical and traditional influence. I specifically mean the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and the strategic Far Eastern regions. They wanted to control everything without creating an equal pan-continental architecture. From the Euro-Atlantic Center, as they see it, these ideas still remain relevant for them. They are doing everything they can to hold on to them. I don't know what will happen to NATO after the Greenland drama. But this specific psychological mentality is very, very profoundly and inextricably rooted, deep within the collective minds of the European people. Or rather, it is held by most of the current prevailing European political and social elites today. Instead of a comprehensive, pan-continental and fundamentally equal organizational structure, which we strongly advocate for, where the diverse interests and unique needs of every single nation involved would be carefully balanced, and they want to exert total dominance over this incredibly vast, resource-rich, and most densely populous continent on Earth. To govern it from the Euro-Atlantic Center, that was the plan, at least until quite recently. Let me repeat, NATO is in a deep crisis, and the European Union is in a deep crisis. The OSCE is barely hanging on, so I think all these plans are doomed to fail.
We're talking about the military takeover of Greenland. Bill Long, the future US ambassador to Reykjavik, stated what he plans to do with Iceland. He said he would make it the 52nd state of the United States and become its governor. In other words, the Americans are eyeing Iceland and Greenland greedily. If an official inquiry were to come from the authorities in Nuuk and Reykjavik, that is, the capitals of the 2 islands, to the Russian Federation about some kind of agreement, what would your reaction be?
I am currently unable to perceive any specific circumstances or conditions that would render such a possibility even remotely conceivable. And I don't think anyone in Nuuk or Reykjavik is considering this topic. No one is even thinking about it. And if we look at it from a fundamental principle, the logic behind your question is actually somewhat fundamentally misguided and off track. It truly sounds like you are expecting these vulnerable and impoverished territories, one that is already on the very brink of being taken over, and the other, which will inevitably be the next one in line, to come running desperately to us for help. But the point isn't that someone didn't help them, be it Russia, China, or anyone else. The point is that they are members of the North Atlantic Alliance, and right now this alliance is being tested to show what it really is. So, well, let's put it this way. We are not at all interested in interfering in anyone's affairs. I even wrote down some specific quotes. For example, the president of Croatia, Mr. Milanovic, who I think is a very experienced and far-sighted politician, called on President Trump not to put his own interests above the rights of the people of Greenland. Quote, I emphasize, the decision about Greenland's future can be made exclusively by the people of Greenland. Put the people of Crimea in the place of the people of Greenland, and a lot will probably become clear to you. Moreover, in Crimea, people went to a referendum after an unconstitutional coup when the putschists who came to power declared war on the Russian language and sent militants to storm the Supreme Council of Crimea, and in Greenland, no one staged any coups. Simply put, as President Trump said, this territory is important for the security of the United States. Crimea is no less important for the security of the Russian Federation than Greenland is for the United States. And of course, when what's happening around Greenland is justified by saying that otherwise Russia or China will seize it, well, there is no evidence for that. And in the West, economists and political scientists are already refuting these claims. In any case, we proceed from the fact that this issue, we are not involved in this matter. We are certainly closely monitoring and observing the developments. This is a serious geopolitical situation, and we will formulate our definitive conclusions based on exactly how this critical issue is resolved.
Colonialism and the issues of island nations were mentioned. How could we not give the floor to representatives of the British media in this case? Please, Sky News.
By the way, Maria just said Britain, and with no offense intended, I believe we should call Britain Britain. Because Great Britain is the only example where a country calls itself great. It calls itself that. There was another example, the Libyan Jamahiriya, but it no longer exists.
Please.
No offense. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to everyone here today for your time and attention. It is quite remarkable and interesting to note that, following the conclusion of the presentation, there was not even a single question raised by anyone in the audience for me to address at this particular moment. Open, free Arctic cooperation within the framework of the Arctic Council, where the security, economic, environmental interests, and the interests of indigenous peoples and all participants in Arctic interaction, all members of the Arctic Council, would be taken into account. It was not us who stopped cooperation in this structure. It was not us who broke off contacts. They are showing interest in resuming discussions within the framework of the Arctic Council, unlike some Europeans, although at the technical level these contacts are being maintained. When the leaders of European countries, including those mentioned, for 4 years have been saying that with Russia, it is absolutely impossible to sit at the same table, and then suddenly, when they feel like it, trying to stand out from the crowd, who all in unison demand to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Suddenly they say, actually, we need to. Here, for example, Merz said that Russia is a European country, that we need to talk to them. It suddenly dawned on them. So, for those who want to have a serious conversation with us, I advise not to announce it loudly and then proudly look around at the audience. And if there is a genuine, serious interest, you just need to call, as diplomats do, without any accusations. Like, I made such a threat, I'll talk to Putin with you. Macron has already announced once again some time ago, last year, that French President Emmanuel Macron called President Putin. Nothing that was said in that phone conversation was any different, notwithstanding the widely acknowledged fact that Paris, including President Macron himself, has consistently said and continues to say repeatedly in public these, specific instances when Macron met with Zelensky in November of last year. Even I, personally, could not resist the urge to quote Macron's exact words here, to illustrate the current diplomatic situation. After meeting with Zelensky, Russia itself chose the path of war. Nothing justified this war, not a single real threat, only fabrications. All of this is in complete disregard for the truth, under the influence of the reflexes and instincts of a state that cannot come to terms with its own history. Isn't that just rude? Is this really how little they care about Russia? Of course, we are above this and treat such statements accordingly. Not even with contempt, but dismissively. Because if anyone, the French cannot help but remember the history of Russia, He cannot fail to understand that history is not about what Kajakala said, about the 19 wars allegedly started by Russia against Europe over the past 100 years. But history is about the fact that starting with or continuing with Napoleon, and then with Hitler, who mobilized almost all of Europe in order to defeat and break up Russia, that is where history begins. And that is something our people will never give up. I leave these statements to Macron's conscience, just as I leave the claim that a war between NATO and Russia will start before 2029. The last time this was said was by Pistorius. Did I pronounce that correctly? In short, he is, to put it simply, the Minister of Defense of Germany. So, if someone wants to talk, we will never refuse, even though we understand perfectly well. Let me make a reservation, though, that with the current leaders of Europe, it is highly probable that it is completely impossible to reach a mutual agreement on any single issue. They have pushed themselves far too extensively and deeply into a state of deep-seated animosity and hatred toward the Russian nation.